As I travel through this pilgrim life, there is a friend who walks with me, leads me safely through the sinking sand. It is the Christ of Calvary. This would be my prayer, dear Lord, each day to help me do the best I can. For I need God light to guide me day and night. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Yes, I need thee every hour. Through this land, this pilgrim land, thy saving power, hear my plea, my feeble plea. Lord, dear Lord, look down on me when I kneel in prayer. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Let me travel in the light divine, that I may see the blessed way. Keeps me that I may be holy and sing redemption song someday. I will be a soldier brave and true, and every firmly take a stand. As I onward go and daily meet the foe, blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Yes, I need thee every hour. Through this land, this pilgrim land, thy saving power, hear my plea, my feeble plea. Lord, dear Lord, look down on me when I kneel in prayer. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. When I wander through the valley toward the setting of the sun, lead me safely to a land of rest, if I a crown of life have won. I have put my faith in thee, dear Lord, that I may reach the golden strand. There's no other friend on whom I can depend. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Yes, I need thee every hour. Through this land, this pilgrim land, thy saving power, hear my plea, my feeble plea. Lord, dear Lord, look down on me when I kneel in prayer. Blessed Jesus, hold my hand. Be seated, please. Good morning. Y'all are good. Man, y'all can sing. That is great. Mike, where'd you run off to? There you are. You had got 2 words out of your mouth, and I turned over to Jody and said, I like him. I come from a family of preachers, okay? And I'm not used to holding a mic. But I was asked to change mics because every time I turned my head, you lost me. So I'm going to try and keep the sound with us this morning. I come from a family of preachers. My dad was a preacher. His brother was a preacher. My brother-in-law was a preacher. I'm a preacher, and unfortunately, the 3 best preachers in our family is my sister, my niece, and my daughter, okay? So I'm just hoping I'm number 4 in the family. I'll tell you a story, and this didn't happen to us, but this is So you know a little bit about Jody. This is what she does for me. Preacher, and true story, not all preacher stories are, if you didn't know that. Preacher was at a gospel meeting, one of those week-long gospel meetings, and the first night they got up and introduced him and said, this is one of the great preachers in the brotherhood, and he and his wife are, headed back to the hotel that evening, and he says, how many great preachers are there in the brotherhood, do you think? And his wife looked at him and said, one less than you do. Well, that's kind of where Jody keeps me, just take it easy. Let's begin with prayer this morning. Father, you are a great God, and forgive us for so often missing an encounter with you. Forgive us for becoming blind to your grace and your love and your actions in our lives. Forgive us for not being grateful for all the blessings that you poured out on us, especially the blessings of fellowship and family, the things that we can't own, like nature, great art. Father, this morning, as we turn our attention to your Son, as he reveals you to us, give us eyes to see and ears to hear, and we ask it in his name. We're going to begin in Psalms 42 this morning. It's a psalm that you're probably familiar with, and Jody, we did graphics that were so small I can't read them on the monitor back there. But here's 42:2. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. Where can I go and meet with God? Now, David, who we believe wrote this, has a deep, passionate, meaningful relationship with God. His question is, when can I go meet with God? When can I be with God? I'm guessing nobody ever asked you that question. No one has ever asked me that question. But I have been asked the question, where can I meet God? Where do I encounter God? Where is this God that you speak of? And I'll tell you, it's usually in times of distress and pain and suffering. I have been blessed to be in rooms where the one this person loved the most will not be here much longer. That is an honor that not all of us get to have. I have stood beside way too many gravesides and mourned with families as they buried the one they loved. And that's usually where the question comes, where's God? Where was God in this? Where do I meet with God? Where do I encounter God? And you know the answers as well as I do that we usually turn to church. Many of us, this is our primary encounter with God in worship. Again, I loved your singing. You've made my wife so happy. Jody loves singing. She's not much on preachers. Well, she's got one, I'm glad she likes one. But we encounter God in worship. And maybe you're the type that encounters God in a deep, meaningful prayer life. And that's where you find God. I worked 15 years part-time as a fishing guide on the Texas Gulf Coast. I've seen more than my share of sunrises coming up over the Gulf. It's gorgeous. Maybe you're a mountain person. I'm sorry if you are. Do you encounter God in nature? Well, I would think Scripture would support that. And maybe it's Scripture where you encounter God. Maybe you are a deep lover and student of the Word. All those are valid. But I want to suggest one more place we might encounter God that maybe we don't think of. This is a pretty common scriptural theme through the Hebrew Scriptures, through the Christian Scriptures. Genesis 18, 3 strangers, 3 men show up, Abraham sitting in front of his tent. You know the story. 3 strangers show up, and they tell Abraham and Sarah, a year from now there's going to be a boy. Of course, Sarah laughs. I think I'd laugh too. And then, as they're leaving, God decides to inform Abraham about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. God shows up in the form of 3 strangers. That's a little different. We're going to put up Luke 24, 13 through 25. This is the encounter on the road to Emmaus. That same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. Jesus has risen from the dead at this point. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Now, we don't know exactly how they were kept, but obviously he did not appear as himself. He didn't appear in a form that they would recognize. He appeared in the form of a stranger. One of the more beautiful encounters that this theme carries out is in John 20. And this is at the resurrection. Do we have John 20? There we go. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head, the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." Again, Mary, who had been around Jesus a lot, doesn't recognize him. When she turns to him, I don't know why. Is it because she's got tears in her eyes? I don't think so, because the scripture seems to indicate there's a bigger problem than that. Jesus doesn't appear as he was. Jesus shows up as a stranger. One more, Matthew 28, and this is a really this is really odd. Jesus is about to ascend back to heaven. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Doubted what? What in the world are they going to doubt? They aren't doubting his power. They aren't doubting his appearance. They have to be wondering, is this the guy that we followed for 3 years? Is this the same guy? Jesus appears as a stranger. And even Jesus' teachings support this. Matthew 25, one of the few times that Jesus gives us a picture of judgment. And he says it's like a shepherd separating sheep and goats. And the sheep are on his right hand, the goats are on his left hand. And he says, "What? I was a stranger. I was sick. I was hungry. I was naked. I was in prison. And you did or you didn't." And both groups, fascinatingly enough, say the same thing. When did we see you as a stranger? Jesus shows up in the other. Recognizing God seems to be a little difficult because God keeps that's a little different. Okay. God keeps showing up as a stranger. People keep encountering God as someone they don't recognize. Now, we're going to walk through a little Greek this morning, and this is not real common for me. I don't like Greek. I hate Greek. I am not a Greek scholar, but my brother-in-law is. His graduate degree is in biblical languages, so if it's Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic, I got a guy to go to. You may be familiar with the word xenophobia. Anybody know what xenophobia means? Fear of a stranger. Okay? Xenos is the Greek word for stranger. And it carries a darker, a little bit of a dangerous tint to it. It's like when we tell our kids, don't talk to a stranger, because there's danger there. That's kind of the feel of this word xenos. But interestingly enough, in Greek, if I'm a xenos and you invite me into your house, I'm still a xenos, but now the word is going to be translated guest. So it means both stranger and guest. It shows up in the New Testament about 14 times, and it's used as stranger and guest every single time except in one place. And that is in Romans 16. We got that? Gaius, whose hospitality. That word hospitality there, the root word is host. Guess what the word is? Xenos. So now we've got a word in the original language that means stranger, guest, host. Mike Cope says that this is kind of like playing whack-a-mole. You know, you don't know what the definition is because it keeps changing all the time. And I think there's something to be learned there. It's interesting that Jesus and Paul and Jesus' disciples kind of blur these lines between who's the guest and who's the host and who's the stranger. And it may be that this is when we're at our best as believers, when there aren't these distinctions. So where do I meet God? Jesus is hard to recognize sometimes, or maybe just easy to miss. How many times have you avoided a stranger and possibly missed out on an encounter with God? A close friend of mine, Steve Hare, was on staff with a very large church. They sent him to a conference out in California. Steve grew up in New York. And Steve knew how to handle strangers because he grew up in New York. And he would always stay at a hotel, you know, a little farther away from the conference because it would be cheaper and it would be better for the church. So he would always be walking to the conference. And in this conference, he was walking and a guy falls in behind him. And you could tell this was a street guy, and Steve knows what you do, right? You just don't pay attention. You just keep walking. And this guy said, "Hey!" Steve keeps walking. "Hey!" Steve keeps walking. "Hey!" So Steve turns around and says, "What?" He says, "Will you be my friend?" Steve says, "Sure, I'll be your friend." He said, "What's your name?" "My name's Steve." "Great." That was it. And Steve goes on. Next day, Steve's walking. There's a Mercedes-Benz dealership, and next to it is an alley, and there's an ambulance, and they are bringing a body out of this alley. And they stop and pull the cover off of the body and say, "Anybody recognize this guy?" And Steve goes, "Yeah, I recognize him." They said, "Here's his stuff." Steve said, "I don't want his stuff." They said, "Take his stuff." "Okay, I grew up in New York." So he takes his stuff, and for the most part, it's a little notebook. And in the little notebook, there's a page with a heading that says "Friends." And there's one word: Steve. How many of us miss an encounter with God because we avoid a stranger? Now, Jesus' teachings, they're clear. We have to follow. We're called to follow, to imitate Jesus. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of times we find Jesus right under our noses if we'll open our eyes. This one who's so hard to recognize takes us to places that may be hard to be, but that's where he is. A few years back, where I preached, we became the emergency heating and cooling shelter for the homeless in our city. And if it got below 33, we opened up our building for them to spend the night. And if it got above 90, 98, 99, we opened our building during the day so they could get some water and be in the air conditioning. On Thursdays, we opened our building so the homeless could shower. And what happened is all of a sudden, we start getting to know all these homeless people. And the first night we opened up, I walked in, and a friend of mine, Johnny Stafford, is there, and he's talking to one of these guys, and he says, "Mike, this is Randy, our preacher." And Mike says, "Oh, you said he was afraid of me." And Johnny said, "I don't think I said that. I don't think Randy's afraid of much." And I said, "Mike, why do you think I'm afraid of you?" He said, "But Mike's corner was a half a block from our building. And I drove past Mike all the time. And he said, you always point at me when you drive by." I said, "No, I don't. That's a wave." You know, that's how Texans wave. And we started a relationship. And I'd take Mike breakfast some days. I'd get Mike and go to lunch some days. I'd just sit at the corner with Mike for a while some days. Mike could come in when it was cold and then when it was hot. And Mike was the shepherd of all the homeless guys in Victoria. If we needed to know, if we needed to make contact with one of the homeless people, all we had to do is find Mike and say, "Hey, where's," and Mike could tell you. And Mike was my host. And I was a stranger that he welcomed into the homeless community in Victoria. And I became Mike's host and ushered him into the life of the church. He would come to the men's breakfast. And then he started coming to a breakfast we served on Sunday morning. And then he started coming to class. And then he started hanging around for our lunch. And then Mike was always there. And about 2 or 3 weeks before I left Central, I got to baptize Mike. It wasn't that I was the host and he was the guest. It wasn't that I was serving and he was served. We were equals on this journey. And I had a chance to encounter the living God in a relationship with a homeless guy. Jesus attacks our comfort zones. And he pushes us into places where we're not comfortable, places where we're the stranger. I think it's a healthy thing that sometimes at church, your own church, you become the stranger. Have you ever had a visitor in church that somehow took you to a different place? You may have seen this on the national news. Early this year, the mosque in Victoria was burned. It was a tragedy. The Muslim community in Victoria is a wonderful group of people. They do good work through the community. Most of them are doctors and nurses. Somebody burned their mosque. And that happened on Friday. On Saturday, it started going out that there was going to be a prayer service on Sunday at the mosque. And everyone was invited. And they shut down 2 blocks of Airline, which is a major thoroughfare in town. Just shut it down, and it got filled up with people. The imam was there. Our rabbi from our Jewish community was there. 3 pastors from churches were there to all pray. And the whole crowd was this mix of people. 3 churches in that community said, "Our church is yours." 3 Christian churches said, "Come use our church." The Jewish community said, "Come use our temple, it's yours." I don't know how much money was raised in those first 2 days. Do you remember, Jody?
Over
$100,000 in the first weekend to rebuild that mosque. Now, Jody and I went to the prayer service, and we're standing in the street with all these people that we don't know. We know some of them, we know a handful of them. But a community gathered to pray. Do we all agree on everything? No. But there was part of our community that was hurting. And the rest of us gathered to pray God's blessings over them. Let me tell you, it's one of the most moving experiences of prayer that I have ever had. And it was in the presence of people I considered strangers, but at that time, we were kind of all strangers, and we were all guests, and we were all hosts. Now, I've got to make a confession to you. Got to the hotel last night with Jody and started going over the 3 lessons that I had put together for this week, and I told her I messed up. I missed it. Because I have been preaching to the choir, okay? You people have been wonderful. Friday night, the elders and their wives were just a joy. We were strangers, but they invited us in, and all of a sudden, us Xenos were guests. And they made us feel so welcomed. And this morning, you've allowed me to get up here as a host and invite you into the scriptures and maybe see them a little different than you might have seen them before. But you people seem to have this down pretty good. And I mean that with all of my heart. You are, if not the warmest, welcoming group of Christians I've ever seen. You gotta be in the top 2. And I don't know who the other one is. So we all play the role of guest and host and stranger. So where do you meet God? Look around. Look around. Mom, Dad, when you get home today, look around.
One of the best things you can do is sit and engage with that child. And I don't care what age they are. My kids are in their 30s. And I still think it's one of the best things I can do, to sit and listen and hear their concerns and their doubts and their fears and their joys. And I have an opportunity to encounter the Spirit of God that lives in them. So, the invitation this morning is to open your eyes, open your heart. See if you can't find God in the other this week. See if you can't fulfill Jesus' words in your life. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Let's stand and sing.
There's a fountain free, it's for you and me. Let us taste the waves to its spring. 'Tis the fountain.